He stood at the pinnacle of English society, a duke with estates spanning 3 counties, wealth beyond measure, and influence that reached the very corridors of Parliament. Yet Edward Ashford, the Duke of Ravenscroft, found himself imprisoned by the very privileges that should have set him free. For 28 years, he had been groomed for duty, moulded for power, prepared for everything, except the devastating moment when he would meet Grace Hartley, a governess with fire in her eyes and nothing in her pockets, and realize that all his fortune could not purchase the one thing that truly mattered. What he would discover, in the most humiliating manner imaginable, would shatter the carefully constructed world of England's most powerful duke. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what part of the world you're listening from. I want to know how far it has traveled. The spring of 1885 brought unseasonably warm weather to London, and with it, the beginning of the social season that would determine the fate of England's elite. Within the walls of Ravenscroft House, a palatial mansion overlooking Hyde Park, Edward Ashford prepared for a future that had been predetermined before his birth. The Duke of Ravenscroft stood before the tall windows of his study, watching carriages roll past on the street below. At 28, he possessed the sharp features and commanding presence expected of his station. Dark hair perfectly groomed, steel-grey eyes that could silence a room, and the broad shoulders of a man who rode daily across his vast estates. Yet there was something restless in his bearing this morning, a tension that his closest associates might have noticed had they been observant enough. "The arrangements are finalized, Your Grace," his secretary announced from the doorway. "Lady Arabella Worthington and her family will arrive at Ravenscroft Manor next month for the official engagement announcement." Edward did not turn from the window. Of course they will. The marriage had been arranged when he was merely 12 years old, a strategic alliance between 2 of England's most powerful families. Lady Arabella was beautiful, accomplished, and perfectly suited to become a duchess. She played the pianoforte with technical precision, spoke flawless French, and had been raised with the singular purpose of managing a great household. On paper, she was everything a duke could want, yet Edward had never been asked what he wanted. His days followed a rigid pattern established by centuries of tradition. Morning correspondence regarding estate matters, afternoon meetings with his steward and various members of Parliament, evening social engagements where he performed his role with practiced ease. He owned 17 estates, employed over 300 servants, and controlled the livelihoods of thousands. He had power that men would kill for, but Edward Ashford had never made a single meaningful choice for himself. "Your Grace, there is one matter requiring your attention," his secretary continued somewhat hesitantly. "The governess for your niece, Lady Catherine. The position remains unfilled. The agency has sent another candidate." Edward waved his hand dismissively. His younger brother's death 2 years prior had left his 8-year-old niece, Catherine, in his care. The child had proven difficult, cycling through governesses at an alarming rate. "Have the housekeeper handle it. I trust her judgment." "The housekeeper specifically requested your approval, Your Grace. The candidate is unconventional." "Then send her away. We have no time for unconventional arrangements. The household must be in perfect order before Lady Arabella arrives." What Edward did not know, could not have possibly known as he stood in his study that morning, was that his carefully ordered world was about to collide with a force that no amount of wealth or power could control. In the servants' entrance below, Grace Hartley was removing her worn gloves and taking her first steps into Ravenscroft House. She had travelled from Yorkshire with her last £5 and a letter of recommendation from a vicar who believed in her abilities despite her unconventional methods. At 24, she had already been dismissed from 3 governess positions for encouraging her charges to think independently rather than simply memorize and obey. She had red gold hair that refused to stay properly pinned, green eyes that missed nothing, and an unfashionable habit of speaking her mind. She owned 2 dresses, both carefully mended, and had no family, no fortune, and no prospects beyond the slim hope that this position might finally be the one where her different approach would be valued. Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, looked her up and down with barely concealed skepticism. "You understand that Lady Catherine is a particular child. She requires firmness and discipline. She requires understanding and patience," Grace replied, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "Children who have lost their parents need compassion, not simply more rules to follow." The housekeeper's expression softened slightly. "You may have an opportunity to demonstrate your methods, but I warn you, Miss Hartley, His Grace expects perfection. He tolerates no disruption to the household order." Grace nodded, though something rebellious stirred in her chest at the mention of this distant duke who valued order above all else. She had met many powerful men in her work, and most of them viewed children as small adults to be molded and corrected rather than understood. As Mrs. Pemberton led her through the servants' corridors toward the nursery wing, Grace caught glimpses of extraordinary wealth. Marble floors polished to mirror brightness, paintings by masters, fresh flowers in every room despite the cost. It was a world so far removed from her own experience that it might have been a different country entirely. Lady Catherine's governess would not meet the Duke himself, of course. Men of his station did not concern themselves with household staff. Grace would occupy the same house, yet inhabit an entirely different world, invisible and insignificant, or so she believed. Edward spent the remainder of that day in meetings about agricultural improvements and railway investments, then attended a dinner party where he sat beside Lady Arabella and discussed the weather with the same enthusiasm one might bring to reviewing account ledgers. She smiled appropriately, laughed at appropriate moments, and demonstrated why she had been chosen for him so many years ago. "I look forward to our life together," Arabella said as the evening concluded, her voice pleasant and entirely devoid of genuine emotion. "Ravenscroft Manor is such a magnificent estate." "Yes," Edward replied, because what else was there to say? "It is magnificent." He returned to his empty study that night and poured himself a whiskey, standing once again at the window. Somewhere in the great house, servants were completing their duties, fires were being banked, and life was continuing in all the ways it always had. In 1 month, he would formally announce his engagement. In 3 months, he would marry. In a year, if fortune permitted, there would be an heir. His life would continue along its predetermined path, gilded and empty, powerful and hollow. Edward drained his glass and wondered, not for the first time, if a man could have everything the world valued and still feel as though he had nothing at all. He did not know that 3 floors above, Grace Hartley was sitting beside a sleeping child who had finally stopped crying, holding a small hand and making a silent promise to be different than all the governesses who had come before. He did not know that their worlds, carefully separated by every rule of society and station, were about to intersect in ways that would transform them both. The golden cage of Edward's life was about to spring open. He simply did not know it yet. 3 weeks passed, in which the household of Ravenscroft House settled into new rhythms. Grace proved different than expected. Lady Catherine, who had screamed at her previous 4 governesses, began attending lessons willingly. The child's tears became less frequent, her tantrums subsided, and she was even heard laughing in the nursery, a sound that startled the housemaids. Mrs. Pemberton mentioned this improvement to His Grace one morning, though Edward barely registered the information. He was preoccupied with the approaching house party at Ravenscroft Manor, where his engagement would be formally announced to 300 of England's most influential people. The guest lists had been finalized, menus approved, and every detail arranged with military precision. "Your niece has requested to attend the welcome dinner, Your Grace," his secretary mentioned. The new governess thought it might be beneficial for Lady Catherine to begin learning proper social— "Absolutely not," Edward cut him off. "The child is 8 years old and prone to outbursts. She will take her meals in the nursery as always, and remind the governess to stay within her duties." Yet that evening, as Edward reviewed correspondence in his study, he heard unusual sounds from the gardens below. Genuine laughter, both a child's bright giggles and a woman's warm, unrestrained mirth. Curiosity drew him to the window. In the fading light, he saw his niece Catherine running across the lawn, her usually pale cheeks flushed with joy, chasing after a young woman in a simple grey dress. The woman, the governess, he realized, was playing with the child, actually playing, her red gold hair coming loose from its pins as she ran, her face alight with happiness. Something unfamiliar stirred in Edward's chest as he watched them. When had he last seen anyone so unguarded, so genuinely joyful? When had he last felt such freedom himself? The governess caught Catherine and spun her around, both of them laughing, and for a moment Edward forgot every rule of propriety and simply stared. The young woman was beautiful, in a way that had nothing to do with fashion or artifice. There was life in her, a vitality that made the carefully curated world around him suddenly seem like a collection of wax figures. He pulled himself away from the window, disturbed by his reaction. She was a servant, he was betrothed, such thoughts were beneath him. But that night he could not quite forget the sound of that laughter. The house party began with the arrival of 60 guests at Ravenscroft Manor, Edward's principal country estate. Lady Arabella came with her parents, Lord and Lady Worthington, along with her younger sister Charlotte, a vain creature who viewed the world as a stage for her own performance. The manor buzzed with activity, footmen carrying trunks, maids preparing rooms, and the constant hum of aristocratic voices. Edward played his part perfectly, greeting each guest with appropriate warmth, discussing politics with the gentlemen, and complimenting the ladies on their attire. He stood beside Arabella during the welcome reception, noting how perfectly they looked together, her golden beauty complementing his dark features, both of them the picture of aristocratic breeding. "You must be so thrilled," one dowager said to Arabella. "To be Duchess of Ravenscroft, such an honor." "I have been preparing for this role my entire life," Arabella replied, her tone suggesting she viewed the dukedom as a particularly desirable piece of jewelry she had finally secured. The formal announcement was planned for the following evening's ball, but the engagement was already an accepted fact. Edward moved through the pre-dinner gathering in the drawing room, accepting congratulations, feeling increasingly trapped by each well-meaning comment. Then he saw her. Grace Hartley stood partially hidden behind a column in the gallery above the drawing room, holding Catherine's hand. They must have been on their way to somewhere else when Catherine had begged to see the guests. Grace was clearly trying to keep the child quiet and invisible, but Catherine pulled forward, wanting a better view. And Edward, despite knowing he should not, despite every rule of propriety screaming at him to look away, found himself watching Grace instead of his guests. She wore the same grey dress, her hair carefully pinned, but already showing signs of escape. She was whispering something to Catherine, probably trying to convince the child to leave, when her eyes met his across the distance. The connection lasted only seconds, but Edward felt it like a physical shock. Those green eyes saw him, truly saw him, in a way no one in that glittering room below ever had. Not as the Duke of Ravenscroft, not as a title or fortune or political alliance, but as a man. Grace's eyes widened in recognition. She must have realized this was the master of the house, the Duke she had never formally met. She quickly gathered Catherine and disappeared from view. Edward stood frozen, his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the whiskey he had been drinking. "Darling," Arabella's voice cut through his thoughts. "Lord Pemberton was just asking about your stables." He turned back to his guests, to his duty, to the life that awaited him. But something had shifted, some crack had appeared in the foundation of his carefully constructed existence. The next evening brought the grand ball, the formal announcement, and the moment that would change everything. The ballroom of Ravenscroft Manor had been transformed into a glittering wonderland of candlelight and flowers. 300 guests filled the space. the cream of English society, dancing, drinking, and witnessing what they believed would be the culmination of a perfect aristocratic match. Edward stood at the top of the grand staircase in his formal attire, Arabella beside him in a gown that cost more than most people earned in a year. His father's closest friend, the Marquis of Blackwood, prepared to make the official announcement. "Lords and ladies," the Marquis began, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent ballroom. "It is my great privilege to announce the engagement of His Grace, Edward Ashford, Duke of Ravenscroft, to Lady Arabella Worthington." Applause erupted. Champagne glasses were raised. Edward looked down at 300 smiling faces, all celebrating the continuation of dynasty and power, and felt absolutely nothing. Then the doors to the terrace opened, and a figure rushed in. Lady Charlotte, Arabella's younger sister, her face flushed, her dress slightly dishevelled. She moved through the crowd toward the staircase with purpose, and Edward saw with sinking realization that she was crying. "I cannot stay silent," Charlotte announced dramatically, her voice carrying across the ballroom. "I cannot let this farce continue." "Charlotte, control yourself," Lady Worthington hissed, but it was too late. Charlotte reached the base of the stairs and looked up at her sister with genuine anguish. "Tell them, Arabella. Tell them the truth. Tell them who you truly love." The ballroom fell into shocked silence. Every eye turned to Arabella, whose face had gone pale. "You're being hysterical," Arabella said, but her voice wavered. "Am I?" Charlotte turned to address the crowd, tears streaming down her face. "My sister has been conducting a secret romance for over a year. With whom, you ask? With Captain James Morrison, a mere soldier without title or fortune. They have been meeting in secret, exchanging letters, planning their future together." Gasps echoed through the ballroom. Edward stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. "That is a lie!" Arabella's mother shouted, rushing forward. But Charlotte pulled out a bundle of letters from her bodice, holding them high. "These are my sister's own words. James, my dearest love, soon this pretense will end, and we can be together. Shall I read more?" "Charlotte, please." Arabella finally spoke, her perfect composure cracking. "You do not understand." "I understand perfectly." Charlotte's voice broke with genuine pain. "You intended to marry the Duke for his fortune, while keeping your true love as your secret. You would have your duty and your passion. But I love James too. I have loved him for years, and you stole him from me with your beauty and your promises." The revelation hung in the air like poison. Edward looked at Arabella, searching for denial, for explanation, and found instead the truth written plainly on her face. She had been planning exactly what Charlotte described, a marriage of convenience to him, while maintaining her real romance elsewhere. "Your Grace, I can explain," Arabella began, but her voice was desperate rather than convincing. "It is not as my sister suggests." "Is it true?" Edward asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Do you love another man?" The questions seemed to break something in Arabella. Perhaps it was the public humiliation, or perhaps it was the relief of being discovered, but she lifted her chin with sudden defiance. "Yes," she said clearly. "I love James Morrison. I have loved him since I was 17, but I have my duty to my family, as you have yours to your title. We are both trapped by our positions, Your Grace. I thought we might at least be honest about that." "Honest?" Edward descended the stairs slowly, aware that every person in the ballroom was witnessing his humiliation. "You call this honesty? Planning to marry me while loving another? Using me for my fortune while keeping your heart elsewhere?" "As if your heart was ever engaged," Arabella shot back, her own anger rising. "You have never looked at me with anything beyond polite interest. You agreed to this marriage for the same reason I did, because it was arranged, because it was expected, because neither of us had the courage to demand more from life." Her words struck Edward with uncomfortable truth. He had been willing to enter a marriage without love, to fulfill his duty and ask for nothing more. Was he any less guilty of deception? "But I would have honored our vows," he said quietly. "I would have been faithful. You would have been miserable." Arabella replied, and now genuine regret showed in her eyes. We both would have been. At least be honest about that. The Marquis of Blackwood, attempting to salvage the situation, stepped forward. This is clearly a case of pre-wedding nerves and family conflict. Perhaps if we all retire and discuss this matter privately— No, Edward said firmly. He looked at Arabella, at Charlotte still clutching her evidence, at 300 faces staring at him with shock, pity, and barely concealed satisfaction at witnessing such spectacular drama. The engagement is ended. Lady Arabella is free to marry whom she chooses. He turned and walked through the crowd toward the doors, hearing the explosion of conversation erupt behind him. Whispers, gasps, excited chatter about the scandal that would dominate London society for months. The Duke of Ravenscroft, the most eligible bachelor in England, humiliated before the entire aristocracy, rejected for a man with no title, no fortune, no power. Edward walked blindly through the manor, his chest tight, his mind spinning. He found himself in the gardens, without consciously choosing the direction, standing in the darkness with his fists clenched, trying to breathe through the humiliation. He had wealth, power, title, estates, everything society valued. Yet a woman had chosen a poor soldier over him, because the soldier had offered something Edward never could: love. Real, genuine, passionate love. The realization crashed over him with devastating force. He had spent 28 years following every rule, fulfilling every duty, sacrificing every personal desire for the sake of responsibility and tradition. And what had it earned him? A life so empty that a woman chose poverty with a man she loved over wealth, with a man she did not. Edward sank onto a stone bench, putting his head in his hands. For the first time in his life, the Duke of Ravenscroft wept. The scandal erupted across London with the force of a summer storm. Within days, every drawing room in England buzzed with the delicious details. The Duke of Ravenscroft, publicly humiliated, his betrothed preferring a penniless captain, the sisters' dramatic revelation, the letters read aloud in the most exclusive ballroom in the country. Edward retreated to Ravenscroft House in London, refusing all visitors, declining all invitations. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, descended upon him with righteous fury about the damage to the family name. The Marquis of Blackwood suggested he immediately pursue another advantageous match to demonstrate he was unaffected. His solicitors worried about the political implications, but Edward, for the first time in his life, ignored all of them. He spent his days in his study, going through the motions of estate business, while his mind churned with questions he had never allowed himself to ask. What did he actually want from life? Who was he beyond his title? Had he ever made a single choice based on his own desires rather than duty? The only bright spot in the house was the laughter that occasionally drifted from the nursery wing. His niece Catherine continued to thrive under Miss Hartley's care, and one afternoon Mrs. Pemberton brought a report that caught his attention. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Grace, but I thought you should know. Lady Catherine read an entire book today, at her own request. Miss Hartley has been teaching her through stories rather than rote memorization, and the child is flourishing." Edward looked up from papers he had been staring at without seeing. "The child can read now." "More than that, Your Grace. She is curious, engaged, happy. Miss Hartley has accomplished what 4 previous governesses could not. The child actually wants to learn." After Mrs. Pemberton left, Edward sat thinking about the young woman he had glimpsed only twice. Once laughing in the garden with unrestrained joy, once looking at him with eyes that seemed to see his soul. A governess, a servant, someone so far below his station that society would say she barely existed. Yet she had succeeded where others failed because she had offered something different. Not rigid rules and harsh discipline, but understanding and compassion. What Edward decided next would have shocked anyone who knew him. He requested that Miss Hartley bring Lady Catherine for a visit to his study. He wanted to see his niece's progress for himself. Grace received the summons with trepidation. In the 3 weeks since the disastrous ball, she had been acutely aware of the Duke's presence in the house like a storm cloud hovering overhead. The servants whispered constantly about the scandal, about his Grace's heartbreak, about the shame and humiliation. She had felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for the distant, powerful man she had glimpsed only once. To be rejected so publicly, to have one's humiliation witnessed by hundreds, it was cruel, regardless of station or wealth. "Do I have to be perfectly still and silent?" Catherine asked worriedly as Grace helped her into her best dress. "Will Uncle Edward be angry if I speak?" "Your uncle asked to see you because he's proud of your progress," Grace said gently, though she was not entirely certain of that. "Be yourself, sweetheart, that is always enough." They descended to the main floor, entering a world of marble and grandeur that still intimidated Grace despite weeks in the house. A footman led them to the study doors, knocked, and announced them. "Lady Catherine and Miss Hartley, your Grace." "Enter," came the deep voice from within. Grace's breath caught as they stepped into the study, and she saw the Duke of Ravenscroft clearly for the first time. He stood by the window, much as she had seen him that distant evening, but now she could see the details, the strong line of his jaw, the grey eyes that held intelligence and unexpected vulnerability, the broad shoulders that carried the weight of responsibility with visible weariness. He was devastatingly handsome in a way that made her heart skip unexpectedly. But more than that, there was something in his expression, a loneliness, a questioning, that called to something deep within her. "Uncle Edward!" Catherine surprised them both by running forward, then stopping suddenly, remembering she was supposed to be formal. But Edward did something that shocked even himself. He knelt down, bringing himself to the child's level. "Hello, Catherine. I hear you have been working very hard in your lessons." The simple gesture of kneeling, of meeting the child at her height rather than looming above her, told Grace everything she needed to know about the man beneath the title. Whatever else he was, Edward Ashford understood kindness when it mattered. Catherine's face lit up. "I read a whole book, Uncle. Miss Hartley found one about a girl who solves mysteries, and I could not stop until I knew the ending." "That is remarkable," Edward said, and he meant it. His eyes lifted to Grace for the first time, and again she felt that electric connection, that sense of being truly seen. "You have accomplished something extraordinary, Miss Hartley. My niece has never shown such enthusiasm for learning before." Grace curtsied, her cheeks warming under his gaze. "Lady Catherine has always had the capacity, Your Grace. She simply needed someone to show her that learning could be joyful rather than merely dutiful." Something flickered in Edward's eyes at the word dutiful, as if it had struck a chord. He rose slowly, still looking at Grace in a way that made her skin tingle with awareness. "An interesting philosophy," he said quietly. "Do you believe all worthwhile things should bring joy rather than simply being done out of obligation?" Grace knew she was treading into dangerous territory, but something in his expression, a genuine question, a real desire to know, made her answer honestly. "I believe, Your Grace, that a life lived only for duty, without passion or genuine desire, is only half a life. We are not machines to be programmed. We are human beings meant to feel, to want, to choose." The silence that followed was charged with unspoken understanding. Edward stared at this young woman in her mended grey dress, this person who should have been invisible to him, and felt as though she had reached into his chest and pulled out every question he had been asking himself since that terrible night in the ballroom. "Miss Hartley," he said slowly, "would you be willing to take tea with me and Catherine? I should like to hear more about your educational methods." It was an extraordinary breach of protocol. Dukes did not take tea with governesses. The distance between their stations was absolute, the boundary never crossed. But Edward was tired of rules that made no sense, tired of walls that separated him from anything genuine. And Grace, despite knowing she should refuse, despite every practical instinct screaming at her to maintain proper distance, found herself nodding. "I would be honored, Your Grace." What began that afternoon as a discussion of Catherine's education evolved into something neither Edward nor Grace could have anticipated. The Duke found himself genuinely enjoying conversation with someone who challenged his assumptions, who spoke her mind respectfully but honestly, who treated him like a person rather than a title. Grace discovered that beneath the aristocratic formality was a man who asked thoughtful questions, who listened without condescension, who had a subtle humor that emerged when he allowed himself to relax. The servants noticed. Mrs. Pemberton reported to the cook that His Grace had smiled during tea, actually smiled, something not seen since before the scandal. The footman whispered about how the Duke had requested Miss Hartley's presence 3 times that week to discuss Catherine's progress. And in London's drawing rooms, Edward's aunt, Lady Margaret, heard rumours that made her frown with concern and, surprisingly, hope. Lady Margaret was Edward's deceased father's sister, a widow who had scandalously chosen to live independently rather than retreating to her son's household. She was 60 years old, iron-grey hair, sharp eyes, and a mind that society found dangerous because she insisted on using it. She had watched her nephew sacrifice every personal desire for duty and had long wondered when the cage would finally break. The scandal at Ravenscroft Manor had been humiliating, certainly, but Lady Margaret had seen opportunity in the wreckage. Edward was free. The question was whether he would choose to remain imprisoned by society's expectations or dare to want something real. When she heard the whispers about the Duke taking tea with a governess, Lady Margaret acted decisively. She arrived at Ravenscroft House unannounced, swept past the protesting butler, and marched directly into her nephew's study. "Aunt Margaret," Edward rose, startled. "I was not expecting—" "Of course you were not. When did you ever expect anything good to happen without planning it to death?" She settled into a chair without invitation, studying him with those penetrating eyes. "You look terrible, by the way, but also more alive than I have seen you in years. Tell me about the governess." Edward felt heat creep up his neck. "I do not know what you—" "Do not insult my intelligence, Edward. The servants talk, and I listen. You have been spending time with Miss Hartley. The household is buzzing with speculation. So tell me, who is she?" Edward moved to the window, his refuge in times of discomfort. "She is Catherine's governess, an intelligent woman with unconventional methods that have proven remarkably effective. And nothing. She is a servant. I am a duke. There is nothing more to say." Lady Margaret laughed, a sharp sound without humour. "There is everything to say. For the first time in your life, Edward, you are free. That dreadful arranged marriage is finished. The expectations and plans laid for you since childhood have crumbled. You can choose whatever life you want. So what will you choose? Another perfect aristocratic bride who will give you perfect aristocratic heirs and a perfectly empty existence? Or will you dare to want something real?" Edward turned to face his aunt, his expression tortured. "You speak as though I have options. I am the Duke of Ravenscroft. I cannot what? Cannot be happy, cannot choose love over duty, cannot live as a human being rather than a title." Lady Margaret rose and crossed to him, her voice softening. "Your father was my brother, and I loved him, but he raised you to be a duke first and a man second. The scandal has given you a gift, Edward, the gift of freedom. Do not waste it by returning to the same cage, just with a different jailer." After his aunt left, Edward stood in his study for a long time, her words echoing in his mind. Could he truly choose differently? Could a duke marry a governess? The idea was absurd, scandalous. Society would never accept it. But when Grace brought Catherine for their afternoon visit, and he saw her smile, heard her laugh at something his niece said, watched the genuine warmth and intelligence in her eyes, Edward felt something he had never felt before. He felt the possibility of happiness, and for the first time in his life, Edward Ashford, Duke of Ravenscroft, began to wonder if he might have the courage to reach for it. 6 weeks after the scandal, Lady Margaret convinced Edward to attend a lecture at the Royal Society on agricultural innovations. "You cannot hide forever," she told him firmly. "And this is intellectual society, not the vultures of the aristocracy. Come with me, I insist." Edward agreed primarily because his aunt would not relent, but also because something in him had shifted. He was tired of cowering from the scandal. He had done nothing wrong except try to honor an engagement that had been fundamentally dishonest from the start. What he did not expect was for Grace to be there. Lady Margaret, with characteristic meddling, had suggested to Mrs. Pemberton that Miss Hartley might enjoy educational lectures, and that perhaps a cultural outing would benefit both her and young Catherine. The housekeeper, sensing something brewing and curious herself, had arranged for them to attend. So when Edward entered the lecture hall, scanning the crowd with practiced indifference to the whispers and stares his presence generated, his eyes found Grace sitting in the upper gallery with Catherine beside her. She wore a different dress, still simple, but a soft blue that brought out her eyes. Her hair was carefully arranged, though tendrils were already escaping. She was pointing something out to Catherine in a program, entirely absorbed in the moment, unaware of being observed. Edward's heart did something unexpected in his chest. Lady Margaret followed his gaze and smiled with satisfaction. "Ah, what a fortuitous coincidence. Perhaps you should greet your niece after the lecture." "You arranged this," Edward said, not quite accusingly. "I merely suggested possibilities. What happens next is entirely your choice, nephew." She patted his arm. "Make the right one." The lecture on crop rotation techniques was enlightening, though Edward retained little of it. His attention kept drifting to the gallery above, where Grace listened with genuine interest, occasionally whispering explanations to Catherine that kept the child engaged. When the lecture concluded, Edward made his way to the gallery with Lady Margaret in tow. Grace saw them approaching and rose quickly, curtsying with Catherine beside her. "Your Grace, Lady Margaret. What an unexpected pleasure." "Uncle Edward!" Catherine exclaimed, forgetting formality. "Did you hear about the nitrogen fixing in legumes? Miss Hartley explained how it helps other crops grow stronger." Edward smiled at his niece's enthusiasm, then met Grace's eyes. "Miss Hartley seems to have a remarkable ability to make any subject engaging. Knowledge becomes interesting when we understand its application to real life," Grace replied, a hint of defiance in her voice, as though challenging him to disagree with her methods. Lady Margaret, watching this exchange with keen interest, intervened smoothly. "Miss Hartley, I do not believe we have been formally introduced. I am Edward's aunt. I have heard remarkable things about your work with Catherine." Grace blushed at the attention from a woman of Lady Margaret's standing. "You are very kind, my lady. Catherine is an exceptional student." "Intelligence runs in the family," Lady Margaret said, her eyes twinkling. "As does stubbornness, though some have yet to recognize when they are being stubborn about the wrong things. Miss Hartley, there is a small gathering after the lecture, refreshments and discussion. Would you and Catherine care to join us? I believe it would be educational for the child." Edward shot his aunt a look that clearly said she was overstepping, but Lady Margaret ignored him with practiced ease. Grace hesitated, knowing she should refuse, that a governess did not attend social gatherings with her employer, but something in Lady Margaret's expression, a warmth, an invitation to possibility, made her nod. "If it would not be an imposition." "Delightful," Lady Margaret declared, and just like that, they were drawn into a circle of intellectuals, reformers, and progressive thinkers who populated Lady Margaret's social world. These were not the rigid aristocrats of the ton, but rather scientists, writers, educators, and philanthropists who valued ideas over titles. Grace found herself in conversation with a female doctor, a rarity in England, who spoke passionately about women's access to education. Edward stood nearby, ostensibly discussing railway investments with a fellow peer, but really watching Grace blossom in this environment. She spoke with confidence about educational theory, debated kindly but firmly about women's intellectual capacity, and held her own among people who would have intimidated many of higher social standing. She was magnificent. "Your Grace seems quite taken with his niece's governess," a voice said beside him, and Edward turned to find Lord Pemberton, a man he knew from Parliament, watching him with knowing eyes. "I admire her skill as an educator," Edward replied carefully. "Of course," Lord Pemberton said, though his tone suggested he saw through the deflection. "Though I confess, after the unfortunate business with Lady Arabella, I imagined you would be more cautious about matters of the heart." Edward's jaw tightened. "There are no matters of the heart, Pemberton. Miss Hartley is my niece's governess. Nothing more." "A pity," Pemberton said unexpectedly, "because happiness, Your Grace, is considerably more valuable than propriety. And I have never seen you look at anyone the way you look at that young woman." Before Edward could respond, a commotion near the refreshment table drew their attention. Charlotte Worthington, Arabella's younger sister, had arrived with a group of society ladies, clearly stumbling into the gathering by accident and looking immediately out of place among the intellectual crowd. Charlotte's eyes found Edward, and something like embarrassment crossed her face. She had, after all, been the architect of his public humiliation, even if her motives had been her own jealousy rather than deliberate cruelty toward him. She approached him with visible reluctance, her companions watching eagerly for more scandal to report. "Your Grace, I did not expect to find you here." "Lady Charlotte," Edward replied coolly. "Apparently, intellectual pursuits are full of surprises." Charlotte flinched at the subtle barb. Then her eyes moved past him to where Grace stood in animated conversation. "Is that a servant?" she asked with barely concealed disdain. "How quaint that they allow just anyone into these gatherings now." Something protective flared in Edward's chest. "That is my niece's governess, Lady Charlotte, a highly educated woman whose intelligence and capability far exceed many of her supposed betters." Charlotte's eyebrows rose at his sharp tone. My, have we developed democratic sympathies along with our public embarrassments?" "Charlotte," one of her companions giggled nervously. "You should not—" "I should not what? Acknowledge that the Duke was humiliated, that my sister rejected him for a man with nothing but love to offer, that he was found wanting in the one thing that actually matters?" Charlotte's voice had risen, drawing attention from nearby groups. Edward felt the old shame rise, the memory of standing before 300 people as his failures were exposed. But then he saw Grace looking at him with concern, not pity. He saw Lady Margaret watching with fierce pride, as though daring him to let society wound him again. And he realized something crucial. Charlotte was right. He had been found wanting because he had offered nothing real. No passion, no genuine feeling, no actual desire for the woman he was meant to marry. He had offered duty and wealth, and those things, in the end, meant nothing without heart. "You are correct, Lady Charlotte," Edward said clearly, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet gathering. "I was found wanting because I was willing to accept a marriage without love, a life without genuine feeling, an existence that valued propriety over passion. Your sister chose differently, and I honor her for having the courage I lacked." Charlotte gaped at him, clearly not expecting this response. Edward continued, something breaking free inside him as he spoke. "I spent 28 years being who I was supposed to be, doing what I was supposed to do, wanting nothing for myself because wanting was inappropriate for a duke, and it earned me exactly what such a life deserves, nothing of value. So yes, I was humiliated, but I'm grateful for it, because now, for the first time, I am free to ask myself what I actually want." The gathering had gone completely silent. Lady Margaret was beaming. Grace stood frozen, her eyes locked on Edward's face with an expression of wonder and something deeper, something that made his heart race. Charlotte, for once in her life, had nothing to say. Lady Margaret broke the tension by raising her glass. "To honesty," she declared, "and to the courage to choose happiness over obligation." Several people in the gathering echoed the toast, and gradually conversation resumed. Charlotte and her companions left quickly, no doubt rushing to spread this new scandal, the Duke of Ravenscroft defending his servant and declaring himself free of society's expectations. Edward made his way to Grace, who was standing with Catherine now, the child drowsy against her side. "Miss Hartley, I should apologize if my comments caused you any discomfort." "No," Grace interrupted softly, her eyes shining. "No apology is needed, Your Grace. That was the bravest thing I have ever witnessed." Their eyes met and held, and Edward knew with absolute certainty that this woman, this governess with her mended dresses and her fierce intelligence and her capacity for joy, this woman had become everything to him. "Miss Hartley," he said quietly, so only she could hear, "Grace, would you permit me to call on you properly? Would you allow me the privilege of your company, not as my niece's governess, but as yourself?" Grace's breath caught. She knew what he was asking, knew the impossibility of it, knew every reason she should refuse. A duke and a governess. Society would never accept it. She had no fortune, no family, no status. But she had already fallen in love with him. With his kindness to Catherine, with his genuine questions, with the loneliness she recognized because it matched her own, with the man beneath the title who was finally allowing himself to emerge. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Your Grace. I would be honored." Lady Margaret, watching from across the room, smiled with satisfaction. The game had changed, and Edward, for the first time in his life, was playing for something that actually mattered. The courtship that followed was unconventional by every measure, yet Edward approached it with more certainty than he had felt about anything in his life. He no longer cared what society thought. He had been their perfect duke, and it had earned him nothing but an empty existence. Now he would choose differently. He began by taking Catherine and Grace on outings to museums, art galleries, botanical gardens, always properly chaperoned by Lady Margaret, always with the excuse of Catherine's education, but everyone involved knew the truth. The Duke of Ravenscroft was courting his niece's governess. London society erupted with scandalized delight. The gossip columns could barely contain themselves. First rejected by his betrothed, now pursuing a servant. "Has the Duke taken leave of his senses?" one paper declared. Another wrote, "The fallen Duke finds comfort in low places." Edward's mother, the Dowager Duchess, descended upon Ravenscroft House in a fury. "You will make yourself a laughing-stock. The family name will be destroyed. You must end this madness immediately." "The family name survived worse," Edward replied calmly, "and I am finally doing something that makes me happy. I thought you would want that for your son. I want you to do your duty, to marry appropriately, to provide proper heirs, not to throw yourself away on some nobody with red hair and impertinent ideas." "Mother," Edward said, his voice hard, "you will not speak of Miss Hartley in that manner. Not in my house, not ever." The Dowager Duchess stared at her son, seeing perhaps for the first time the man he had become. "You truly care for her," she said finally, her voice caught between disbelief and unwilling understanding. "I love her," Edward replied simply, "more than I have loved anything in my life, and I will not give her up for your approval or society's opinion." His mother left without another word, and Edward knew he had likely severed that relationship permanently. It hurt, but not as much as losing Grace would have hurt. Not everyone was hostile. Lord Pemberton sent a note of support. Several younger members of Parliament who had known Edward for years expressed private approval of his choice, and Lady Margaret naturally was his fiercest champion. "Let them talk," she told Edward over tea. "Half of them are miserable in their own proper marriages. Your happiness threatens their careful justifications for their own compromises." But it was Grace who struggled most with the attention. She had never sought to rise above her station, had never imagined a duke might fall in love with her. The weight of society's judgment fell heavily on her shoulders. "Perhaps we should stop," she told Edward one afternoon in the gardens, her voice breaking. "I do not wish to be the reason you are estranged from your family, mocked by society, considered a fool." Edward took her hands in his, not caring who might see. "Grace, before I met you, I was already estranged from everything that mattered. I was estranged from my own desires, my own heart, my own capacity for genuine feeling. You did not take me away from a good life. You showed me that a good life was possible. Do not ask me to return to the darkness simply because the light makes others uncomfortable. Tears slipped down Grace's cheeks. I love you. I have loved you for weeks, and I tried not to because I knew it was impossible. But I cannot bear to see you hurt because of me. Then say yes, Edward whispered, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Say yes, and let me be hurt by joy instead of emptiness. Say yes, and let us choose each other. Consequences be damned. Grace stared at the ring, a single perfect emerald surrounded by small diamonds, green like her eyes. It was not a family heirloom, laden with the weight of generations, but something Edward had chosen himself, something unique and beautiful and entirely for her. Your Grace. Edward, he corrected gently. Say my name, Grace, please. Edward, she whispered, the name feeling like a prayer on her lips. Are you certain? There will be no going back from this. I am more certain of this than I have been of anything in my life. Grace looked into his grey eyes and saw her future written there. A future of love and partnership and genuine companionship. A future that would be difficult but real, and she made her choice. Yes, she said. Yes, Edward, I will marry you. The announcement of the engagement caused an even greater sensation than the scandal at the ball. Duke to marry governess, the papers screamed. Society ladies clutched their pearls and declared it the end of civilization. Men in clubs debated whether Edward had gone mad or was actually brilliant for choosing passion over propriety. Charlotte Worthington, reading the news with her mother and sister, felt an unexpected pang. Her dramatic revelation had destroyed one engagement, but had somehow led to something that looked remarkably like genuine happiness. It made her own shallow concerns seem petty in comparison. He looks happy, she murmured, studying the sketch of Edward and Grace together in the paper. He looks ridiculous, her mother sniffed, throwing away his position for a servant. But Charlotte, perhaps for the first time in her vain life, wondered if she had been wrong about what truly mattered. The soldier she and Arabella had fought over had chosen neither of them in the end, finding their grasping ambition equally unattractive. She was 23, considered beautiful, from a wealthy family, and completely empty inside. Meanwhile, the Duke, who had been publicly humiliated, was glowing with genuine happiness. It was an uncomfortable realization. Edward and Grace prepared for their wedding with surprising speed. Edward saw no reason to wait, and Grace's only family was an elderly vicar in Yorkshire who sent his blessing along with joyful tears. Lady Margaret organized a wedding that was deliberately different from what society expected. Not a grand cathedral ceremony with hundreds of aristocratic guests, but an intimate gathering at a small church, with people who genuinely cared about the couple's happiness. Scientists from the Royal Society, educators Grace had met, a few of Edward's true friends, and of course Catherine, who served as flower girl with unrestrained enthusiasm. The night before the wedding, Edward sat in his study going through documents with his solicitor, ensuring Grace would be protected financially regardless of what happened. He was settling a generous sum on her, separate from his estate, so she would never be dependent or vulnerable. Your Grace, the solicitor said carefully, I must advise you that this marriage will cause complications. Some in Parliament will use it against you. Your mother has threatened to contest aspects of the family settlements. Society can go hang, Edward interrupted pleasantly. I spent 28 years living for their approval. It bought me nothing. Now I am living for my own happiness. If that causes complications, then I will deal with them gladly. Grace, in her simple room in the servants' wing for the last time, packed her few belongings with trembling hands. Tomorrow she would become a duchess. Tomorrow her life would change forever. She was terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. Mrs. Pemberton knocked softly and entered, her stern face showing uncharacteristic emotion. Miss Hartley, I wanted to say, you have been good for this house, good for Lady Catherine, and good for His Grace. He's a different man than he was 3 months ago. Happier. more alive. Thank you, Mrs. Pemberton. That means a great deal. The housekeeper hesitated, then added, You will make a fine duchess. Not like the others, perhaps, but better, I think, because you will remember what it means to be human. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful. Grace wore a simple ivory dress that Lady Margaret had commissioned, elegant but not ostentatious. Her red gold hair was dressed with real flowers rather than jewels. She looked like herself, only more so, radiant with happiness and nerves and love. Edward waited at the altar and felt his breath catch when he saw her walking down the aisle. No grand procession, no hundreds of witnesses, just Grace moving toward him with her whole heart in her eyes. This moment was real in a way nothing else in his life had ever been. Dearly beloved, the vicar began, and Edward barely heard the words. He was too busy looking at Grace, memorizing every detail of this moment. When it came time for vows, Edward spoke his clearly. I, Edward Ashford, take you, Grace Hartley, to be my wife. I promise to choose you every day, to love you above duty, to honor your intelligence and your spirit, and to spend my life trying to deserve the extraordinary gift of your presence. Grace's voice trembled but held strong. I, Grace Hartley, take you, Edward Ashford, to be my husband. I promise to see you always as the man you are, not just the title you bear, to challenge you when needed and support you always, and to love you with everything I am. When the vicar pronounced them married, Edward kissed his bride with a joy that made several guests discreetly wipe their eyes. Lady Margaret beamed with satisfaction. Catherine cheered loudly, breaking all decorum. And for just a moment, two people who had been lonely their entire lives were no longer alone. The small wedding breakfast that followed was filled with genuine warmth and laughter. Lord Pemberton toasted, "The bravest duke I know." Lady Margaret declared it the beginning of a revolution. Catherine gave a surprisingly eloquent speech about how Uncle Edward smiled now and how Grace was the best thing that ever happened to their family. Edward and Grace left London that evening for Ravenscroft Manor in the countryside, away from society's eyes, ready to begin their life together. As the carriage pulled away, Grace looked at her new husband, this man who had chosen her above everything society valued, and felt overwhelming gratitude for the courage it must have taken. "What are you thinking?" Edward asked, his arm around her. "That you gave up a great deal to marry me?" "No," Edward corrected gently. "I gained everything worth having. Everything else was just pretty decoration on an empty life. You, Grace, are the life itself." She kissed him then, and Edward knew with absolute certainty that he had finally made the right choice. He had chosen love. He had chosen happiness. He had chosen a real life with a real woman who loved him not for his title, but for himself. And in doing so, the Duke of Ravenscroft had found the one fortune that all his power could never purchase. He had found home. 18 months after the wedding, Ravenscroft Manor had transformed into something it had never been during generations of ducal occupation. A home filled with genuine warmth and laughter. Edward stood in the library, reviewing correspondence with his steward, when he heard familiar sounds from the gardens below. Grace's laugh, Catherine's excited chatter, and a new sound, the babbling of their 6-month-old son, Thomas. He moved to the window and saw his wife sitting on a blanket beneath an old oak tree, their son in her arms, Catherine reading aloud from a book. Grace still wore simple dresses, though now finely made, and her hair still escaped its pins in that way that made Edward's heart skip. She looked up as though sensing his gaze and smiled, that radiant smile that was his alone. Edward set aside his work and went to join them. "Papa!" Catherine called when she saw him. She was 10 now, thriving in ways that seemed miraculous compared to the sad, frightened child of 2 years ago. Grace had suggested they hire tutors for Catherine here at the manor rather than sending her to a school, and the girl was flourishing with the individualized attention. "Uncle Edward has been teaching me about estate management," Catherine announced proudly. "He says someday I might manage my own properties, even though I'm a girl." Your Aunt Grace convinced me that intelligence is not limited by gender, Edward said, settling beside his wife and pressing a kiss to her temple. A lesson I should have learned sooner. Grace leaned into him, baby Thomas grabbing at his father's fingers with determined strength. Your steward seems less convinced. I saw his expression when you suggested that tenant farmer's daughter for the scholarship. Edward sighed. Change comes slowly, even when you're a duke, apparently. But the scholarship will be awarded to the most qualified candidate regardless of gender. I have spoken. My revolutionary husband, Grace teased, her eyes dancing. You made me this way, Edward replied, not entirely joking. Before you, I never questioned the system. I simply accepted everything as it had always been. It was true. Grace's influence had rippled through every aspect of Edward's life. He had begun implementing progressive farming techniques on his estates, establishing schools for tenant children, and speaking in Parliament for reforms that horrified his more conservative peers. He was considered radical now, possibly mad, certainly inappropriate for a duke. He had never been happier. Lord Pemberton sent a note, Grace said, pulling a letter from her pocket. He wants your support for the education bill. He says your voice could sway some of the fence-sitters. Then he shall have it. Edward looked at his wife, still amazed that this brilliant woman had chosen him. What do you think of the bill? They discussed politics for several minutes, Grace's insights as sharp as any advisor's, while Catherine played with her baby cousin and the afternoon sun painted gold across the gardens. This was their life now. Intellectual partnership, genuine companionship, shared purpose beyond mere duty. Not everyone had adjusted well. Edward's mother, the Dowager Duchess, had not spoken to him since the wedding. Several old friends from his previous life had quietly distanced themselves. Invitations to certain aristocratic gatherings had ceased, but new friendships had formed. Lady Margaret was a constant presence, delighted with her nephew's transformation. The intellectual circle Grace had introduced him to welcomed them both, and surprisingly, some younger members of the aristocracy had begun following Edward's example, choosing love over arrangement, passion over propriety. You're starting a dangerous trend, Lord Pemberton had told him, with a laugh at a recent gathering. 3 more unconventional marriages this season alone. The matchmaking mamas are in despair. Good, Edward had replied. Let people choose their own happiness. Now, as afternoon faded toward evening, the family made their way back to the manor for dinner. Catherine skipped ahead, Edward carried his drowsy son, and Grace walked beside him with her hand in his. Do you ever regret it? Grace asked quietly. The lost friendships, your mother's estrangement, the social position you sacrificed. Edward stopped walking and turned to face his wife fully. Grace, every morning I wake beside you. Every evening I come home to genuine warmth rather than cold duty. My son will know his father not as a distant figure of authority, but as a man who plays with him and teaches him and loves him fiercely. Catherine thrives because she is valued for herself rather than being molded to fit a predetermined pattern. I have work that feels meaningful and a partner who challenges me to be better. What exactly would I be regretting? Grace's eyes filled with tears. I simply wanted you to be certain, to know I understand the cost. The only cost would have been not having this, Edward said firmly. If I had married Arabella, if I had continued as I was, I would have had wealth and position and status and absolutely nothing of value. You gave me a life worth living, Grace. That is all that matters. That evening, after Catherine was in bed and Thomas settled in the nursery, Edward and Grace stood together in the conservatory, looking out at their land. The duchy was thriving under Edward's progressive management, the tenants healthier and more prosperous than they had been in generations. The manor itself felt alive in ways it never had when occupied solely by dutiful aristocrats going through empty motions. I heard from Charlotte Worthington, Grace said unexpectedly. She wrote to apologize for her behavior at the lecture all those months ago. Edward was surprised. Did she? What prompted that? Apparently, she has been doing charitable work with orphaned children. She says meeting us made her question what she was doing with her life. She sounds different, more thoughtful. People can change, Edward mused, if they find the right reason. You changed, Grace observed. No, Edward corrected, pulling her close. I was finally allowed to be who I actually was, beneath all the duty and expectation. You did not change me, love. You freed me. Grace rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. Do you know what Catherine told me today? She said she wants to be just like us when she grows up. She wants to marry someone she chooses, who loves her mind as much as her face, who treats her as an equal partner. Edward smiled against her hair. Then we have already accomplished something more important than any duchy. We have shown her a different possibility. Your mother would say we are corrupting her. Oh, my mother says a great many foolish things, Edward replied, though there was sadness in his voice. The estrangement from his mother hurt more than he usually admitted. But her approval is not worth sacrificing Catherine's chance at genuine happiness, or ours. They stood in comfortable silence, two people who had found each other against all odds and all sense, creating a life that society had insisted was impossible. The Duke and the governess, a scandal that became a love story, a rebellion that became a revolution, at least in their small corner of England. Edward, Grace said after a while. Yes, love? Thank you for having the courage to choose this. Choose us. Choose love over everything else. Edward turned her to face him, cupping her face in his hands. Grace Ashford, Duchess of Ravenscroft, you gave me more courage than I ever possessed on my own. Every day I am grateful that Charlotte Worthington caused that scandal at my engagement ball, because it led me here, to you, to this life, to choosing bloom over wither, life over mere existence. He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, and felt the absolute rightness of their choice settle around them like a benediction. Months later, during a session of Parliament, Edward rose to speak on the education bill. His voice carried through the chamber with conviction as he argued for giving all children, regardless of gender or class, access to quality education. Some will say this is revolutionary, Edward declared. Some will claim I have been corrupted by inappropriate influences, that I have forgotten my station and my duty. He paused, meeting the eyes of the men who had once been his peers in tradition, if not friendship. They are correct. I have been revolutionized by love, by partnership with a woman whose intelligence equals or exceeds any in this chamber, by watching a child transform when given genuine opportunity rather than just rigid rules. And I'm better for it. This nation will be better for it. We must choose bloom over stagnation, growth over tradition for its own sake, humanity over mere class. The bill passed by a narrow margin, and Edward knew that Grace would be waiting at home to celebrate the victory they had achieved together. Years would pass. Edward and Grace would have 3 more children. Catherine would eventually manage several of the Ravenscroft estates with groundbreaking success, becoming the first woman in their county to hold such responsibility. The progressive changes Edward implemented would ripple through England's aristocracy, slowly but inevitably changing what was possible. But that evening, as Edward returned to Ravenscroft Manor and saw his wife waiting at the top of the steps, her face glowing with pride and love, he knew he already possessed the only victory that truly mattered. He had found the one thing all his fortune and power could never purchase. He had found his heart's desire, and in the choosing, in the courage to reach for real happiness rather than empty duty, Edward Ashford had discovered that the greatest privilege was not being a duke. It was being loved by Grace Hartley. It was being allowed to love her in return. It was choosing every single day to bloom exactly where they had planted themselves, together, in defiance of society, in service of love, in the certain knowledge that happiness chosen is infinitely more valuable than duty imposed. The Duke had every fortune and power, but in the end, he gave them all meaning by choosing the one thing that truly mattered. He chose love, and love, as it turned out, chose him back. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share in the comments where you're listening from. Your engagement helps this story reach others who might need to hear it. Thank you for being part of this journey.